as we, great, everybody can see that. Just admit a couple more people here. Hi, Liz. Great. And then, yeah, folks are still joining, but we'll get started just because we do want to finish right on time today and respect everybody's time. So welcome, everyone. My name is Christy Tataby. I'm a research associate with Farmland Polytechnic University's Institute for Sustainable Food Systems, and we'll be chatting today about the Okanagan Bioregion Food System Project. Computer catch up here. Before we begin, I do want to respectfully acknowledge that the Okanagan bioregion lies within the traditional unceded ancestral territory of the Syilx Okanagan people, and also that the northern portion of the bioregion is also home to the Slatnin band of the Secwepemc Nation. And we wish to express our gratitude at the opportunity to live and work on these lands, and also to our Okanagan Nation Alliance partners who were instrumental in pulling together the project report and reflecting an Indigenous voice there. So thank you to Pauline Terbasket and her team at ONA as well. So as I mentioned, I'm with the Institute for Sustainable Food Systems. The Institute is an applied research and extension unit at Kwantlen Polytechnic University down at the coast, although I live and work in Penticton. And we cultivate sustainable regional food systems that advance the food sovereignty goals of diverse communities. And so I'd like to introduce my colleagues that are here on the call. With ISFS, there's Dr. Kent Mullenix, who's the director of the Institute. And then my colleagues, Emily Henson, Naomi Robert, and Wallapak Polisub are all part of the project team. They're all research associates with the Institute as well. So thanks for all of them for being here. And of course, we would not have been able to do this project without the funding support of various organizations, our main funder being the Real Estate Foundation of BC, but also the regional districts of North Okanagan and Okanagan Seville-Camine, as well as other funding partners. So our gratitude goes out to all of the project funders. So today we've got an hour for our session. We're going to spend about 35 to 40 minutes giving you a bit of a presentation talking about the Okanagan Bioregion Food System Project, the purpose, the design, but spending most of our time looking at the results and talking a little bit about food system policy development. And then we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. So if you can keep track of your questions as we go along and save them for that question period, that would be appreciated. If you're worried you're going to forget or you just want to get it out there, please feel free to use the Zoom chat function, and we'll be monitoring that as we go along. And can kind of facilitate a discussion and get to those at the end in the discussion period as well. So why are we doing this work? Well, we recognize that there's increasing concern with some of the economic, environmental, and social issues that go along with our current dominant global industrial food system of which we all partake every day. Don't need to spend a lot of time on this, as I think most of us are probably aware, but we see habitat impacts from large-scale agriculture. Greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are significant. Economic leakage and corporate hegemony, whereby profits are concentrated in the hands of a few major corporations, and our local farmers tend not to benefit from a lot of that profit. And we also see that we're vulnerable to external system shocks, which we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, supply chain disruptions, etc. And so we often hear re-regionalizing things, bringing our food system closer to home, purported as a potential solution to many of these issues. But it's unclear exactly how regionalizing can benefit and address some of these issues and to what degree. And there's not really good data around that out there. And so that's really the purpose of this project, is to understand what some of those benefits are to a substantial regionalization of our food system, and to put that forward in terms of numbers and dollars and cents to help decision makers and those people, policymakers, make decisions that are going to support our food systems and communities into the future. So just so we're all on the same page when we talk about the Okanagan and bioregions. So bioregions are areas that share the same natural ecosystems and human culture. And we like to look at food systems through a bioregional lens because they link our human activities to the lands that sustain us and recognize that our health and well-being and the health and well-being of our ecosystems aren't separate but are linked. And so it's a functional scale that we can discuss and plan for food systems. It's small enough to be able to coordinate planning, but it's also big enough to include all of those activities that make up the food system, from agricultural production through to waste management. And so the Okanagan, we're talking about the 3 contiguous regional districts, so North Okanagan in the north, Central Okanagan, and Okanagan-Similkameen. And if you're interested in more detail in terms of the methodology and rationale for the selection of this as a bioregion, we do have a project report, a technical report on our project website that details the methodology and rationale there. So I encourage you to check that out for more details. In terms of the project and how it works, there's 3 main components. The first is food system modeling. This is where we use what-if scenarios to understand the potential impacts of the potential economic and environmental impacts of regional food system choices that we might make. So it's not predictive modeling, but it does give us a sense of what may happen as a result of certain decisions that are made in the food system. So that's the modeling piece. But the modeling piece can only address certain questions around the food system. And so we've paired that with a number of additional research projects in areas that deal with things like regional food value chains in the post-production sector, nutrient management, water availability, and social capital and regional food systems. So things that couldn't be measured in the model, we also explore through these additional studies. And then lastly, we also conducted a policy assessment to look at the food policy landscape in the Okanagan, and then did some policy precedent research to address areas that we felt were kind of primed for additional policy development to support regional food systems. So that 3-part approach is kind of what makes up the bulk of the project. So one thing that we recognize that we haven't done very well is that we don't really consider the food self-reliance potential of wild and forage foods, which are central to Indigenous food sovereignty and foodways. And additionally, food self-reliance is calculated for land-based foods in the bioregion only. So obviously we miss out an important component there if we're talking about traditional food systems. And we just want to recognize and acknowledge that that's a shortcoming in the model that we need to be aware of as we move forward and look at these results. So when we talk about what if scenarios, as I mentioned, they model important food system trends and they're not predictive. So we're not trying to say what will happen in the future, but more what might happen if we made certain decisions. And so we have a suite of scenarios that we've developed to tease out some of these trends and food system impacts as a result of decisions. So we start out with the 2016 food system, which is our baseline. We use the current population in 2016, the food production that's happening on the land base in that year, and the actual land base itself as the basis of that scenario. And then we project forward to the year 2050 and look at what happens if we keep everything the same, but our population grows to what it's anticipated to do in 2050, and understand what the impacts of maintaining the status quo are in that circumstance. And then we ask the question, well, what happens if we lose some of our farmland because we make decisions that might, there's a number of reasons we might lose it. We might actually lose it to development. We could have things like wildfires. We could, the land could become so expensive that farmers can't afford to access it, and so it's effectively lost. Or it might be still in agricultural production, but maybe not in food production, so something like cannabis. So there's a number of different reasons that we might lose farmland. We model just a general 20% reduction to understand kind of what that type of loss would result in terms of a number of indicators. And then we ask the question, well, what happens if we take the food that we're growing on the land base and we match that to what people in the bioregion need to eat? So we're really aiming to feed our own population first. And this means that we do that at the expense of exports. So it assumes that people eat local food that's produced in the bioregion first, and it assumes that we choose to produce that food for people to eat locally rather than produce it to export. And so that's the regionalized food production scenario. And so we recognize, however, that we do currently have a very important export sector or export sectors in the region in terms of the major fruit and wine grape sectors. So we also ask the question, well, what happens if we maintain those sectors at their current levels of production and then regionalize our food production on the remaining land base? What are the impacts of doing that? And then lastly, we look at the impacts of reducing our consumption of livestock products with a change in diet that's more aligned with the Eat Lancet planetary health diet, and look at what the impacts of changing our diets would be. And then lastly, currently in the region, we have a fair amount of agricultural land that is ALR land, but it's not actually in active production. And so we look at the impact of expanding our agricultural production to bring those lands, those underutilized ALR lands, into production, and what impact that can have on our food self-reliance and other indicators. One of the impacts we know that will have is an impact to wildlife habitat, given the importance of those natural lands to species at risk, etc. And so we also look at a scenario where we try to mitigate some of those habitat impacts by removing critical habitat from that expanded land base and implementing hedgerows and buffers on all farmland as well. So that's the mitigate habitat impact scenario. So those scenarios are the ones that we have modeled, and we'll talk through the results around each of those scenarios in a second. I will mention that we developed these scenarios based on feedback that we got from stakeholders in a series of workshops that we conducted early in the project, through which we gathered information about local food system priorities and questions that people were interested in. And then for each of these scenarios, we measure and output a series of 13 different indicators. And I'm going to go through these in detail one by one, so I'm not going to run through all of them right here. But what this enables us to do is to see the impacts and trends and kind of general directions when we can compare across scenarios for these different indicators. So I'm going to present a pretty high level overview of the data and results. For those of you that are data nerds that want more detail and are interested to see to do a deeper dive, we do have our summary report, which is available on the project website where you went to sign up for this webinar, so you can download that. Then there's also a series of 9 research briefs that have detailed methods and results for each of the different kind of sub areas of the project, which are available there. And there's also a series of 5 policy briefs that address key local level policy gaps that include precedent research from around the globe. So those will be interesting for the decision makers in particular, and local municipal staff and that kind of thing. So I do encourage you to check out all of the detail that's available on the project website, just because we can't get into all of it in a short presentation like this. So to start with, we're going to look at food self-reliance and consumption indicators. And so the indicators in this group are food self-reliance, which when we're talking about food self-reliance, we're referring to the percentage of the population's food need that the agricultural production in the bioregion can meet. Food imports has an inverse relationship with food self-reliance. So the more food self-reliant we are, the fewer imports we need, and the less self-reliant we are, we need more imports to meet our food needs. And then ecological footprint looks at the area of land that's needed to support the type of consumption that's happening under each scenario. So looking at kind of the key takeaways from this indicator family, what we see in the Okanagan is interesting in that we can, when we prioritize food production to meet local food needs, we can significantly increase our food self-reliance in the region. And this is largely because of our relatively small population compared to the size of our land base. And in so doing, when we increase our food self-reliance, we decrease our need for imports from outside the bioregion, which kind of makes intuitive sense. And so in terms of the data for this, currently our food self-reliance is at about 40%. And I should caveat this by saying that one of the key assumptions in our model is that people will choose to eat locally produced food first. So if they're in the bioregion, they will choose to eat that. And we know that that's not currently the case. So this is, I guess, a theoretical food self-reliance for what would be possible. We know that in reality, it's probably much less than that because we're not all choosing to eat local food. But that, be that as it may, that's what our baseline measurement is around 40%. When we regionalize, so that's where we shift our production to meet the needs of people in the bioregion, we can nearly double that to about 70%. And if we regionalize and then expand the land base that we're using to produce food, in that expand land scenario, we can approach the theoretical maximum food self-reliance, which for this region is 77%. So we get to about 75% with that expand land scenario. And I should mention the theoretical maximum exists because our assumption is that people are going to continue to make diet choices where we eat bananas and strawberries in January, for example, so things that we can't produce here. So there's only a certain amount that we can actually, a certain distance we can go to being fully food self-reliant. In terms of ecological footprint, again, that's of consumption. When we see our population increase locally, we see a higher ecological footprint, which makes, again, intuitive sense because we have more people consuming in that scenario. The key to decreasing our ecological footprint is actually not by relocalizing our production, but by reducing the amount of livestock products that we eat. And you can see that here in the numbers. So this is the total eco footprint for each scenario. You can see in 2016, which is our baseline, when we increase the population, so let's say in the business as usual scenario, we see a proportional increase of our eco footprint. And that doesn't really change when we regionalize our production. It stays pretty similar. So really the eco footprint is tied to the population. What we can do to reduce that is by changing our diet and reducing our livestock consumption or consumption of livestock products. And we can even get it down to below the baseline, even with that expanded population by changing our diet. And so really the take home then is that when it comes to eco footprint, what is being eaten has a greater impact than where it's coming from. And this is because transportation emissions and footprint is relatively small compared to the impact of livestock production. In terms of agriculture and environment indicators, here we look at greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural production in the bioregion, crop nutrient need and nutrient availability in the bioregion, and agricultural water requirements to support the production that's happening under each scenario. So the first one, GHGs, this is looking at carbon dioxide and methane emissions. And interestingly, the take home here is kind of similar to eco footprint, that growing more food locally doesn't decrease our local greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. What it actually, we actually see an increase, I guess, because we're just the types of crops and livestock that we're producing relatively more livestock under that scenario. But again, what does reduce our GHG emissions is by reducing the amount of livestock products that we're consuming. So that diet change scenario is really the ticket there again. And then again, kind of intuitive, as we expand agricultural production on our land base, we see more GHG emissions associated with agriculture. And I guess it's worth pointing out too that under the baseline, there are still GHG emissions occurring, but they're happening in the places where we're importing that food from. So we're not actually kind of owning those emissions currently. We're really externalizing those impacts elsewhere. And when we regionalize and bring that home, we take responsibility for those and kind of count them here where we are. In terms of crop nutrient need and nutrient availability, so here we look at the nutrients that are available in waste streams in the bioregion and compare that to what nutrients the crops that we're producing actually need. And the take home here is that we have more than enough nutrients in organic waste streams to meet our crop needs if we appropriately recover and recycle them. So graphically here, in these graphs, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are portrayed. Nitrogen's the dark red, phosphorus is kind of the mustard color, and potassium is the orange. and nutrient need is on the left and availability on the right. And so you can see in every instance, we have enough nutrients available in waste streams to meet our crop needs. And this is a double-edged sword. It's potentially problematic because those excess nutrients are potential environmental pollutants if they get into groundwater and that kind of thing. So we have to mitigate that by managing those nutrients appropriately. It's also a potential resource in terms of turning them back into or reducing our dependence on synthetic fertilizers from non-renewable resources if we can process them and recover them. And in order to do that, it's going to take policy, capital investment, and cooperation. So we don't currently have those facilities in place to recover all those nutrients, but there's an opportunity there that is just kind of waiting to be realized. In terms of water requirements, this is a big question for all of us, especially this week as we sit here in a drought and in the heat. So again, maybe it makes intuitive sense, but when you produce a lot of water intensive crops, things like forage, for example, it significantly impacts your agricultural water requirements. And so this is for the 2016 scenario. This is the water requirements. Oh, sorry, this is water requirements for the range of different scenarios. Baseline is at the top there. The dark blue is the forage and hay water requirements. The livestock watering is a tiny slice in the middle of the two colors there, that light blue, and then actual crop production is the more teal color. When we regionalize, you can see we see a reduction in the production of water intensive crops like forage. Part of the reason for that is that our model assumes that we continue to import our livestock feed grain. And so we dedicate less land to produce those crops. And so we reduce the amount of forage that's being grown. If we were to actually allocate the land to produce those feed grain crops, we would see that water use increase. And then you can see in the expand land, as we have expanded crop production there, our water use goes up proportionally. And just kind of a useful table to look at. So forage crops, this is the 2016 scenario. Currently, we have 21,000 hectares of forage crops in the region, which is the most significant chunk, I guess. And they're very thirsty crops. They have a high irrigation rate, and so the resultant water requirements are significant there. Tree fruit also have a pretty high irrigation rate and irrigation requirements. We just happen to produce a lot less of them by overall hectare, in terms of overall hectares, than we do the forage crops. So they have less of an impact on the overall water use. So that's really kind of the takeaway, that depending on what crops you choose to produce, that will affect your water use. In terms of habitat and carbon stock, we looked at 3 indicators. I'm probably only going to talk about 1 or 2 in detail because the story is the same for all of them. We looked at wildlife habitat capacity, which is an index that looks at the suitability of the land base, the habitat on the land base for a given scenario for wildlife in terms of their habitat needs. We also looked at connectivity, where we look at the proximity and density of habitat patches, so how easily can animals move throughout the landscape. And then also carbon stock. So that's looking at the amount of carbon that's stored in above ground woody vegetation on agricultural lands. And as I said, the story is the same for all of them. So really the takeaways are that when we expand our agricultural land base into natural areas, we erode our habitat quality and carbon stores because we're taking away that habitat and that carbon. When we can implement critical habitat protections and on-farm enhancements like hedgerows and buffers, we can improve that to a certain degree and also help mitigate some of our carbon losses. And an interesting point here too is that it's those rare sensitive ecosystems that are at a disproportionate risk for agricultural conversion. So these are things like the fertile valley bottomlands next to riparian areas or grasslands. Those are kind of prime targets, I guess, for agricultural conversion, and they're also some of the most sensitive and most important habitats. So they're really the potential risk for conversion is greater for those lands. So just visually what this might look like. So let's say this is our existing condition. We have our cropland area, which is kind of the gray, natural areas are the green, and you can think of those as habitat areas. And then let's say there's a river running through it. If we expand onto land still in the ALR, but that are not currently producing crops, we might see something like this. So we have our cropland kind of takes over the land base there. So what that last scenario looks at is by applying protections like riparian buffers, hedgerows and buffers along the edge of parcel boundaries, for example, we can improve the performance for habitat to a degree. And so in the numbers, but just looking at wildlife habitat capacity, again, this is an index out of 100. And so all of the scenarios that are based on the existing land base have the same result because they're looking at the same land base. And so in 2016, it's actually relatively high because we have this high proportion of natural lands currently in the bioregion at 72%. When we expand onto those habitat areas, that decreases the habitat capacity. And then we can bump it up a little bit with those mitigative measures as well. And again, the story was the same for carbon stock and for proximity and density, basically. So lastly, our economic indicators and employment indicators. We looked at 4 indicators here: GDP, tax revenue, employment income, and the number of jobs. And the takeaway here is that when we regionalize our food system, we can increase our local economic benefits to the bioregion. But in order to realize those benefits, it depends on having a robust local post-production sector functioning and supported. So this includes activities like food processing, storage, and distribution to get those primary agricultural products that we produce in the format and to the people that are going to be consuming them in the bioregion. And currently this doesn't exist. We have most of our processing happens in other places outside the bioregion, and then the products come back if they do. So this is a critical piece of realizing those economic benefits is that post-production sector. So in terms of GDP and tax revenue, by the numbers, again, you can see when we regionalize, we see an increase. But really in terms of dollar values, where we see the greatest potential benefit, I guess, in terms of economics is that scenario where we maintain our existing export sector and then regionalize on the rest. And that's just because that export sector is such an economic engine. It's worth noting though, and we'll talk about this in the context of the jobs. So again, same story. We see some benefit when we regionalize, but really the big benefit comes from maintaining those export sectors. And that's, I mean, you can see that on the right-hand side graph there. A lot of those jobs are in primary agriculture. It's such a labor-intensive industry, and we employ a lot of people in that primary agriculture. It's worth noting, though, that a lot of those jobs, most of those jobs are filled by temporary foreign workers. They're not domestic labor, and so a lot of the dollars that are flowing through those jobs and to those folks are going back home to where they're coming from and not necessarily circulating in our local economy. And so we call that economic leakage. So there's potential in the export-dominated type agriculture to see that and not necessarily realize the benefits that are coming from those jobs and the economic activity that goes along with that. And we can capture more of those economic benefits locally if we have a more fully developed local economic system in our food system. So that was the model results in a nutshell. The additional research suite that I mentioned at the beginning. In this, we explore other food systems dimensions that aren't captured within the model. So things like water supply, demand, and availability. So looking at 3 different subbasins on the Okanagan watershed and comparing their seasonality, supply, demand, and talking a bit about ecological flows in that. We look at nutrient management. So, where are the sources of those nutrients that we have in the bioregion, and where do we need them to be, and what does that look like? Advancing regional food value chain. So how can we support that local post-production sector that's so critical? What could it look like? What are some of the, initiatives that can be taken to develop that sector? The impacts of the local food system on social capital. So this came out of the stakeholder consultations, and people said, well, people always talk about going to the farmers market and meeting their neighbors and how it builds community, but like, what does that really look like? So we look at the impact of participation in the local food system on social capital and social networks in our communities. And then we do the food policy assessment that I mentioned, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second here as well. So I don't have time to go through all of the findings from all of these additional studies, but those are all on that project website as well for folks that are interested. So to summarize again, the key takeaways from the project: strengthening regional food systems can increase our food self-reliance and the local economic benefits of the food system. And in the Okanagan, we're in a bit of an enviable position in that we can kind of have our cake and eat it too, in that we can improve our food self-reliance and also maintain the economic or the export-oriented sectors to a significant degree, whereas other regions might not be able to do that. And that's just because of the proportion of our population to our land base. It's important to note that realizing those economic benefits of regionalization require that post-production sector. And so when we invest in local food processing infrastructure, it allows more of that economic value to be captured in the bioregion and circulate in the bioregion. And it also creates new opportunities for local farmers and local food businesses to develop as well. And it's really a necessary condition to recognize those benefits economically. And then interestingly enough, when we grow more food locally, it doesn't necessarily mitigate the environmental impacts that we're seeing from that food production. But what it does do is it brings those impacts home so that we can address them locally through our policy and planning. So for example, higher local greenhouse gas emissions when we regionalize our agriculture could be addressed through different management of waste, shifting our farming practices to more sustainable methods, and changing our diet locally. So rather than externalizing these impacts to other places, we're owning them, we're taking control of those, and we're able to really bring them home and address them through our local policies. And then lastly, we have to carefully consider the relationship between agriculture and wildlife habitat and those impacts on food self-reliance and Indigenous food sovereignty. So agriculture has been a creation of settler food systems and a cornerstone of them, but it's degraded wildlife habitat and displaced Indigenous people and Indigenous food systems to a large degree. And so moving forward in the future, we have to consider these relationships and think about how to repair and enhance those conditions for wildlife and support traditional food ways. So where do we go from here? What does this all mean, and what can we do to move towards realizing some of these potential benefits? So I'll talk a bit about the policy scan that we looked at as one mechanism for moving things forward. So we conducted a policy scan where we looked at all of the policy in the Okanagan, anything that related to food, and then identified key focal areas. So where does food system policy, where is there a lot of it, and where is there maybe what areas are less prevalent? And then we identified 5 key areas for future food system policy development. They might have been gap areas, or they might have been areas that we thought were particularly critical, like lever points in terms of advancing food system development. So the first, there's quite a bit of policy out there in terms of protecting farmland, but less about making sure that it's being productively used and that it's accessible to farmers and by farmers. So that's the first policy brief area, is supporting farmland access and use by farmers. Secondly, prioritizing ecological stewardship in water policy. So recognizing that there are different users of water, and agriculture is one user, but wildlife also, and fish particularly have needs as well that should be considered. looking at climate change in the food system, and particularly looking at climate change mitigation in the agriculture sector. There's a fair bit of work done around adaptation, but we're also interested in looking at the contributions that agricultural practices can make to mitigating those greenhouse gas emissions. Managing organic waste and improving nutrient cycling. So again, the waste management side of things and recognizing the benefits of those nutrients that we have locally. And then supporting local post-production sector development, which, as I mentioned, this is critical. How can that be done, and how have other places done that, kind of incentivize the development of that sector? So for example, supporting farmland access and use, one of the precedents that we bring forward is looking at lease programs for public land. And the photo is an example from Lucette Farm in North Vancouver, which is city-owned land that's leased to a nonprofit who runs an agricultural operation and community farm and market on those lands. Another example is in the community of Montsartou in France, whereby the municipality actually went out and developed farms, and they have farmers that are on staff with the city to grow food for their public food outlets and canteens, so school cafeterias and that kind of thing. And then there's a number of education programs that go along with that, but that's a municipally owned and run initiative. So that's one example. That's the collective public ownership and management of farmland. And then there's a number of others that we run through. I don't have time to get into them all. I just wanted to give some examples. Then, for example, on the local post-production side, there's different forms of zoning that can be used, like agricultural enterprise zoning and food innovation districts, which allow for the provision of agricultural-related activities that aren't considered farming. There's an example in North Carolina, an example in Boston, Massachusetts. Pitt Meadows here in BC also has an agricultural enterprise zone that's worth looking into. So we call out some of these examples for policymakers to look at and consider. And then taking a step back and looking at future food system policy development, there's kind of 4 guiding principles that need to be considered as we move forward with this. First of all, we need to center equity in any of the policy development that we're doing. So we recognize that people that are most impacted by or food insecurity particularly and are often least represented in planning and policy development, such folks like Indigenous people or BIPOC individuals, those voices need to be considered and brought to the table as we develop policy. We need to have integrated local metrics and data collection so that we have good information to make decisions from. And then comprehensive policy development and collaborative planning. So we need to see food systems planning not as a thing unto itself that's separate from all the other, from transportation planning or housing policy. We really have to see them all as interconnected and take a food systems lens when we're doing all of our other policy development and planning work, and ask ourselves, how will this impact our food system, and you know, or how could this help support the food system? And then the same thing, food systems are multi-scalar, so we have to work across, you know, outside of our own jurisdictions and through with different levels of government and across geographies to work on these this food system planning development and policy development as we move forward. So we've kind of painted a picture. We believe that bringing the food system closer to home can benefit our communities, and that by working together across scales, across domains and geographies, we can take a food system lens in our planning activities and consider equity. We can challenge the status quo and achieve a food system that better benefits our communities and our ecologies. And so we hope that this report has laid the groundwork and we'll start some conversations. We encourage everyone to read it, to ask questions, take it out, start those conversations in your own communities. And of course, we're happy to help support that and be involved in whatever way we can. And I'll mention as well that we have some ongoing funding through another project with the Canadian Institute of Planners. It's some SHRC funding for a 3-year project to work on food systems planning in Canada. And through that project, there's the opportunity to work with local food system stakeholders to co-create a process for food systems planning that will benefit the bioregion and kind of pilot a template, I guess, for food systems planning that other communities could emulate. So we're excited to continue working with our partners here in the Okanagan around that, and and think about what that might look like over the next year and a half or so. So that's it from me. We'd be happy to take your questions and discuss any thoughts or hear any comments that you might have. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Naomi to facilitate that process, and I'll just stop the screen share here so we can see everybody.
Thanks, Christy. Yeah, so we're fortunate enough to have a relatively small group and then a good 15 minutes for discussion. For process-wise, I invite you to unmute your mic and ask the question yourself. And if we're currently engaged in a discussion and another question comes up, feel free to type it in the chat, and I can keep a log of those to make sure that we come back to them. So in terms of questions, we're really interested in hearing all the ones that you have, particularly interested in how understanding how this work might overlap with the work that you're doing, where the potentials are for application and to move this work forward in the region. But any questions about project results, even methods, we're happy to get into that as to the extent that it's helpful and useful.
Naomi, there is a water question in the chat that was asked during the presentation. I don't know if you want to speak to that to start off.
For sure, yeah. So this is a question from Marge, I believe, concerns about water and looking particularly in the news media at the moment, water shortages in the States, in particularly arid regions that are also agriculture. Agreed, there's a lot of both uncertainty and reason for concern around water and water management. We know that water is a limiting factor for agriculture, certainly in the bioregion, and lots of good work to be done around there. What we did look at in the sort of scope of the project is we have sort of 2 or 3 components that touch on water. One is within the modeling scenarios that show the vary at a course level, sort of the relative or the water demand between scenarios that give an idea of the water intensity between scenarios, but recognizing that talking about supply is also an important component. We have a side study that looks at water supply and demand for a few case study basins in the region, asking the questions, to what extent can we meet agricultural demand while importantly mitigating different levels of ecological risk? And then there's a third component in the project as well, where water is embedded into the policy piece, where we're looking at policy precedents and examples for improving water ecological stewardship, particularly in water governance and applications. So those are kind of the 3 ways that we have touched on water. I'm happy to dive into that further as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. If I may just jump in, I have a number of questions. And first of all, thank you, Christy, and everybody on the team for doing this wonderful work. I haven't had time to read all of the material that you have produced. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my 5 questions in the chat, and then you can take them as and how you like them. Some of the questions about methodology, others about larger policy issues, I guess. I guess the first question is, when you model the 20% loss of farmland in the what-if scenario, I'm just wondering whether your modeling was done in a cumulative manner, or was it done as a sudden, all of us, a break, in the sense that something catastrophic happens and you're losing all of that land? So that was my first question. My second question is about the assumption of food reliance. And that seemed to suggest that people will be eating locally produced food. And that obviously implies a change in eating habits. You have sort of hinted at that. I'm just wondering, is your research basically pushing forward the notion of a more plant-based diet? And is that the case? So that's my second question. My third question is more on the larger aspect of your research. So your research suggests that there are close links and connections with the neighboring bioregions, because you do talk about connections that move back and forth. So I was wondering if there is a plan to study the food system at a much larger regional scale that would address BC's food security and sovereignty as a whole. The fourth question is, you did mention about the habitat laws, protecting the habitat. And one of the big industries here in BC is obviously salmon. So I was wondering how you were incorporating seasonally returning livestock like that. Is it incorporated into your model, or is it not at all? Simply because we seem to have lots of trouble trying to estimate the amount of salmon that actually returns year to year. And in this case, many of the bioregions are viable habitats for salmon. And then my last question is more on non-agricultural development. We know from all over the world that prime agricultural land is also prime land for other industrial, commercial, residential purposes. I see that in my own city. So I'm just wondering if loss of such land is incorporated in your estimation of loss of prime agricultural land. So the reason why I ask is further up north, when you're looking at some of the bioregions, you might have major industries like oil and gas, exploration or mining. And I've seen entire mountains being cut apart for mining. Which means that has downstream impact on your bioregion. So I was wondering whether you have thought about incorporating those kinds of large-scale projects that might have fundamental impact on your model. So those are my 5 questions. Thank you. And I see Kent is smiling because he probably knows I ask these kinds of difficult questions. I'll leave it as that.
Thank you. Those are really great questions. If I may, I can run through them, and I might turn them over to some of my colleagues to address as well. So the first one, in terms of ALR land loss and to what extent that, or how that was captured in the model. So what we did was, it was done as a sort of broad sweep 20% land loss in the year 2050. And that was a reduction in the land base of by 20%. And that could have been for a number of reasons. So we recognize that farmland loss in terms of agricultural production could happen for a number of different reasons, because land is too expensive and farmers can't access it, because of non-farm development that you mentioned as well in your 5th question, or perhaps climate change. So we rather than teasing those apart, we put them together and did a bit more of a coarse assessment of a 20% reduction in the year 2050 on farmland loss.
Okay, so can I have a rejoinder to that? The answer, I'm just concerned about where numbers come from, because I know that when you model, a small change in the constant can create major changes in your results and outputs. So I'm just concerned about, or I guess I'm curious about where that magic number of 20% came from. So if it is 15, you might get a completely different result. It's 22%, you might get a completely different result because of how the model works within the systems of iterations. So I'm just hoping that you are aware of your choice of those kinds of numbers. So
for sure, yes, yeah. We modeled a few different scenarios. There was a 10%, a 20%, a 30%, okay. And we found that it was a fairly linear, and correct me if I'm wrong, Olapak did the modeling. It was there wasn't a sensitivity that was triggered, so we picked a moderate level to go with to display the results. Yeah.
Okay, so the reason why I asked is because of thresholds.
I'll just add though that the relationship between the amount of land available and food self-reliance is not super linear. It's like if you have 10% less land, you get 10% food self-reliance. It's not quite like that. So it's the way it works is that when you have a lot of land and you're slowly losing it, you won't see that food self-reliance reduced by a lot. But if the society look at the land we have right now, and then we say, oh, okay, we lose a little bit here and there, that's fine. But eventually when you come to a threshold, that'll be a big shift that, oh no, that's it. Now we've been losing a lot now. And then eventually it would just be too late to go back to what we have before. So it's a little bit something that we have to kind of keep in mind that, losing a little bit of land, it doesn't affect our capacity to produce food that much. But over time, if you keep losing it slowly, eventually it'll be a point where suddenly, food self-reliance go to a very low amount that you can't go back.
Okay. So that's the reason why I asked about the threshold. Yes. Yeah,
it may be worth noting that our model is a static model, not a dynamic model. So we can only look at one thing at a time. And so we have to just line up scenarios and see what the trend is, but it's not a dynamic model.
Thank you, Ken.
Great. So maybe I just wanted to jump in. Thank you, Parthy, for all of your list of questions. Maybe we can just see, we have about 9 minutes left, whether there are other questions from our other participants as well, and then we can come back to your questions as well. We're also happy to follow up with you offline after the webinar too, or stick around at the end and we can follow up. So other questions from other folks, if there are any.
I might ask one which is much more basic than those, but
Great.
I was just going back to one of the findings where I believe you said when we regionalize to prioritize eating local food, you can go from 40% to 70%. And I was just wondering if you could unpack that a little bit for me. So is that like, is there a baseline for the current amount of local food that is staying local and consumed locally?
Unfortunately, that data doesn't exist. And that's always been a thorn in our side in doing this work, is that we don't know how much of food that's produced locally is actually consumed locally currently, because that data is not collected. And so we have to make the assumption that we have to make an assumption. And so our assumption has been that if the local food exists, people will choose to purchase and consume that. I don't know, Kent and others, if you want to jump in and speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's a super important point to make, Liz. Nobody in this province knows, despite all of our efforts to develop local food systems, both in civil society and in government, despite that, we don't know how much food grown in BC or any region for that matter is bought and consumed in that region. We simply, as Christy said, we don't collect that data. So it's very difficult to understand how we're growing effectively. We're growing a BC food economy. So in our model, we simply are forced to assume that people preferentially buy and consume food that's produced in BC.
Yeah.
And therefore, our figure for a baseline food self-reliance, in this case, 38% in the Okanagan, we suspect, but cannot prove, because the data, again, is not available, that is a substantial exaggeration of food self-reliance. And just offering an educated guess, I would say that it is at least probably half of that figure, if not less. But again, you can't, it's just a guesstimate because we don't have the data.
Is that a policy opportunity then to advocate the government collect
Well,
that?
somebody needs to determine this because we need to know it to move forward effectively, to measure change.
That's that local data and metrics piece that's really important.
Got it. Yeah, thank you. I know we'd had these conversations a few years back and I'd wondered if anything had changed.
Not that we're aware of.
Yeah, thanks. I did have one more question, but I'm happy to wait.
Maybe let's just see if any
see if
of
there's
the
any.
other participants, Ron, was that a finger? Yeah. Great.
Just sort of was wondering, as far as government policy, I think it was mentioned of policy scan. One big thing I keep hearing from a lot of my neighbors is the whole situation with abattoirs. People that are trying to raise chickens for eggs are fine, but if you're trying to raise a chicken for meat to sell at the farmer's market or some of your neighbors, that's just about impossible. For some people that have also got maybe marginal land and they want to raise a few cows, you're looking at about 1.5 years before, I think it is, before you can even get it to an abattoir that may be up by Falkland or something like that. So this is a system that's been created by the provincial government's policies that made it very difficult for a lot of the small operators to have a facility to send their animals to get processed. So I wondered if that's been looked at. The other thing too is since I am in the city of Kelowna, I do find, their agricultural plan that they came up with a few years ago was pretty wanting. There wasn't a lot of support for farmers. They've had somebody, at least in the regional district with the Central Okanagan Economic Development, there's one lady there. She's been pretty good about trying to help farmers facilitate ideas and try and move them forward. So I wondered if that's all been kind of looked at as well, how it's sort of varied region to region. Maybe some areas are a little more proactive than other regional districts, for example.
Thanks. Maybe I'll let Kent and or Emily speak to the abattoir meat processing question, and then we can talk a bit about. Kent, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. Ron, it's a really good point. We did not specifically look at the abattoir situation, but we do recognize that this is a real limitation to the development of regional food systems and the vitality of smaller scale, community focused scale farming and livestock production. And it's absolutely something that needs to be dealt with. And it's in that mix of the necessity, and this is really important to emphasize, the necessity to support through policy and economic development strategy, the post-production sector of the food system. It will do absolutely no good to train, support, and encourage local food production if the ability to process it, to store it, to handle it, and distribute it is not also developed.
Yep.
And including abattoirs and the kinds of abattoirs that are needed. And the beauty of this scenario, aside from the policy challenge of it, is that it will, looking at the whole spectrum of the food system, it just provides all sorts of business and economic opportunity for a region. And then, yeah, so Emily, any more to add?
I was just going to mention that we looked at some different examples of regionalized food value chains, which look at sort of how, if we're talking about producing more food locally, how do we actually connect those producers to the end consumer? And so looking at examples, we were able to draw out some kind of key ideas or best practices of like, how are these things developed and what are the really important takeaways? And there is a research brief on that, but I think just to mention like some of the findings from that research, like we really discovered that a lot of these locally developed or regional food value chains are farmer driven. So they're really designed to benefit the needs of the farmer and the producer. So we tried to develop sort of some typologies that were common in different areas, but it was really challenging because these regional food value chains have emerged to serve the needs of specific producers in a specific region. But I think it's important to note that if this is a goal to get more local post-production in the bioregion, we really need to listen to farmers. So that was a key takeaway. Another one is in terms of government responsibility. Governments have a responsibility to remove some of the policy barriers that exist, not only for post-production activities, but also for local food businesses and small business development. So that's kind of a responsibility of government. And then the other one, and the benefit of working at a bioregional scale, is thinking not only how we can support regional food value chain in specific communities, but what does it look like across a larger bioregion, recognizing that even a regional district, the North Okanagan, Central Okanagan, might not have the capacity to support these kind of processing facilities. So maybe we need to think about the broader region and where can these things be located to make sure that they're economically viable and they serve producers. So these are kind of some of the ideas that we explored, but we managed to draw on some really interesting examples from other places. And so that's in the technical report and also in the policy brief about local post-production.
Kirsten. Nice to see you.
Thanks. Really interesting results, and I'm really looking forward to reading the report. So thanks for inviting me to attend. It's I took lots of notes.
Good.
Maybe I'll start asking questions, but I'd be happy to continue this later once I've read the report. One of my questions was regarding the use of hedgerows and maintenance of riparian areas. I think is awesome, a no-brainer. I was really curious what your thoughts were, or if you'd incorporated into the model the additional water requirements that might be imposed by adopting hedgerows or planting or maintaining hedgerows, and what your thoughts were. This is just something that's been rattling around in my brain as it is. So I was really keen to see you mention it, and I was wondering if you'd incorporated that into the modeling.
Great question. I don't actually know the answer, so I'm going to let my colleagues speak to that.
I can jump in there. Yeah, that is a really excellent question. The short answer is the water requirements for hedgerows and riparian buffers are not included in the agricultural requirements. That estimation is based on crop and livestock production only. So that is a really, and as we know, water is a limiting factor for agriculture production in the region, and is why we definitely wanted to add that aspect into the project this time around, building on the work in Southwest BC. So in terms of considerations, those types of mitigative efforts would definitely need to be prioritizing native species, and knowing that the agriculture is limited by water, and that was not something that was in the model. Yeah, that's an excellent point.
I have more questions unless other people want to go.
Yeah, for sure. And then if folks have other questions in mind, feel free to type them in the chat or just raise your hand, and we can pivot when people have their thoughts aligned.
Or just tell me to be quiet. Okay.
All good.
That's great. Another question I had, I thought it was really interesting, your point about the need to develop processing infrastructure and that local capacity for managing and distributing food within the area. And I was curious if we had similar needs for processing organic wastes. It's an issue I keep coming up against with my own research. Is a lot of waste is produced by growers, and there isn't a really carefully managed system for how they will deal with it. And so I was wondering if what your thoughts were about perhaps there being a similar infrastructure needs for managing, processing, and distributing this waste, providing growers with that opportunity to collect and use that material effectively rather than burning it. Yeah, and if your research had encountered a similar gap.
Yeah, I think so. Again, I'm less close to that. I don't know if Emily or Naomi have more to add on that front, or anyone.
I mean, I can probably jump in a little bit and just say that was a major consideration for the nutrient study that was conducted by our colleague out of UBC, and who is now in Sweden, where he does his postdoc research. And so recognizing that the organic waste produced in the bioregion from animal manure and food waste and human excreta far exceeds the crop needs. So recognizing that there is that key management and processing requirement for organic waste. And so his research really goes into detail about some of the spatial considerations. So looking at where livestock production may be concentrated, where food waste may be concentrated sort of in the more urban areas, and some of the conditions there, and looking at circulation of waste within the bioregion, but also the trade-off between waste moving inside and outside the bioregion. So there's some considerations in his research there. But we also put together a policy brief around the consideration of waste management and looking at some of the policy approaches specifically for local government. So what tools might be available for local governments to address this question, and also looking at like the broader policy implications and actions required by provincial and federal governments. So I think the policy research we did was definitely sort of a first step in trying to understand the policy considerations and the tools available for local government. But I think yeah, the findings of the research, recognizing that there is an excess of organic waste and nutrients in the bioregion that require management. So yeah, the policy brief is definitely beginning the conversation and trying to understand the policy challenges and some of the available tools.
Thanks, Emily.
We
I
have a
think if I
question
can
in
just
the,
add that the bottom
Yeah.
line is the infrastructure doesn't exist, Kirsten, just like the infrastructure for the post-production sector.
Yeah,
It simply doesn't exist because it hasn't been in our minds.
Yeah, and I think in some of Robin's research, who focused on the nutrient management, he talked about the potential for nutrient recovery at like a 70% rate, or I think maybe that was the maximum, but recognizing that we currently do not have the capacity for that kind of recovery. So yeah, infrastructure is required, new policy approaches are required. So that really came out in his research for sure.
there's a question in the chat here, maybe we'll bring up at the moment, which is a good one about plans to bring the results to municipal bodies, agricultural committees, and local decision makers, recognizing that time and resources are limited and the capacity to digest some of this work is limited as well. So we have these 3 open webinars, which are quite a high level, and then as well working with on an as requested, sort of as interested basis with local government bodies in the bioregion is something that we are on. We have some work coming up potentially with the Central Okanagan and a few agricultural advisory committees in the area as well. And then perhaps if Emily and Christy are working on a planning project as well, which is more sort of on the operational planning side with the Okanagan bioregion. So hoping to feed these results into that, but definitely we are happy to talk in more sort of targeted policy related terms with bodies that are interested and groups that are interested in hearing more about it.
Yeah, so just to add to that, so we are currently going to be presenting to the RDOS board in early July. So that's the Regional District of Okanagan, Similkameen, and then the RDNO Agriculture Advisory Committee has requested us to come as well, probably later in the summer. And then the Central Okanagan has an interesting mechanism called a planning lab, where they host regional or like decision makers and municipal staff to come together in workshops on specific topics. And so this will be one of their topics for their September planning lab as well. So that's kind of the starting point, but we really go where the interest is and where we've been invited. So if you have folks or other stakeholders or governments that you think would be interested that maybe haven't heard about the project or that we haven't heard from, they're more than welcome to reach out, and we're happy to talk to people about it as they're interested.
There's another question in the chat about, which is an interesting flag about working with producer groups and proposals for the upcoming agricultural climate solutions funding call, and whether or not that's on the table. That's our colleagues. Yeah, that's a good point. And
we'll put it on our next research team meeting.
Yeah, that's great.
We talk about different grant opportunities and that. So,
and that one has definitely been flagged as well.
Certainly always willing and prepared to work with producer groups. Generally, we hope that they will approach us and seek collaboration through applied research and extension. but we've not had any discussions with any at this time.
Are there particular groups, Kristen, that you're thinking of when you mentioned that?
Yes, I think I've heard through ACARN that the BC Agriculture Council and IAF are putting in a proposal, and there's a separate group. Now, I want to say it's perennial fruit producers. I'm not entirely sure on that one. I'll know after the next ACARN meeting, but I guess Kent might be there too, so he'll probably hear about it as well.
Great, thanks for that. And Paul has mentioned the Small Scale Food Processors Association as well. I think we've worked with them on other projects, but not specific to this one.
I have one other question. I was wondering if your projections into the future also considered climatic change and the impacts, for example, on water availability or what types of crops could be produced, or if it was kind of assuming current conditions.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. There's a lot of context that doesn't make it into the presentation. So yeah, I can give the high-level overview, and if folks have other information to add on to that, I invite my colleagues to join. But we spent a lot of time wrestling with how to incorporate climate change, recognizing that 2050 is a timeline that will be very valuable to do so. And ultimately, the model works. At least the modeling portion looks at current conditions, flagging that the climate is very likely to be different than current conditions in 2016 to 2050. The side, sort of the auxiliary study related to water availability looks at, does compare sort of typical conditions with dry year conditions and points to the difference in crop water demand in those dry, and sort of the difference between a wet year and a dry year, or an average year and a dry year, to give some of that important context. But despite the amount of work we did sort of trying to make crosswalks between, like, you know, what the crop, the difference in yield might be, and therefore the difference in production based on different climate scenarios, and how that crosswalk might work with related to yield in different crops. There were too many unknowns in the models to sort of be a reliable and to provide sort of useful information. So we kept it at a 2016 level, and then put context in that, you know, the caveat that water availability and other crop dynamics and, you know, wildfires and pest boundaries as well are going to be important considerations for planning and implementation.
The impact of climate change, Kirsten, on crop yields and what crops will be suitable and what crops will no longer be suitable is such a wild card that it's almost impossible to meaningfully integrate those things in a model like the one we are developed and are using. We did previously in Southwest BC model in crop yield reductions and a commensurate crop yield increase in scenario analysis. And the bottom line was that yield is not the driving force in food self-reliance. It's more land, the amount of land in production. Yield just doesn't impact food self-reliance all that much. So I think in Southwest BC, correct me if I'm wrong, Walpack, we modeled a 20% decrease in yield due to climate change and a 20% increase in yield due to climate change, and the variation in food production from those two, despite the fact that 20% seems like a lot of shift. There was of course some impact, but it wasn't huge.
At one point,
But
we were developing a survey for agrologists in the area, sort of based on what kind of yield impacts they would imagine for different types of scenarios moving into climate change. And that didn't end up being a tool that we used in the end, but we were trying to, come up with creative solutions on how to embed those considerations in the context of what is sort of an optimization model. Yeah.
I mean, your team.
It's an excellent point.
Your team at AAFC and the cherry suitability work with, I mean, we talked to you about that, but there wasn't much data out there for other crops as well. And we model, I think it's 60 different crops in the model. And so there would have just been a lot of assumptions around it. So that's kind of, we do have some kind of caveats and a page on climate change in the report, which you probably can't read from there, but that talks a bit about PKICS data and what the projections are for the region and what the impacts on agriculture might be, but that's more kind of context and narrative rather than data and numbers. So I see Myrna has her hand up.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Hi, Myrna.
Never shy, so I'll ask the first
question. That's great.
So I'm the agriculture program support specialist with the Central Okanagan Economic Development Commission, but I also write and freelance in lots in the agriculture space. So I have two questions about this study. One, Christy, as the lead, perhaps you'll take this on. One is there anything that was surprising to you in this, in your findings here? Did anything stick out for you that you didn't sort of anticipate or think would be the case?
I'm going to invite my team to jump in, but I will start. There was the one that I mentioned, and it's not necessarily surprising because we saw the same trend in Southwest BC when we did this study, but that piece around the environmental or eco footprint in GHG not actually improving when we regionalize. People tend not to, we always hear that we need to eat local so that we reduce our emissions from flying food all around the world, and that actually changing what we eat is really our ticket to reducing our emissions and our footprint. So that, I think, is a key kind of surprising takeaway that kind of flies against what we hear in common discourse. I think it's interesting to note that the Okanagan in particular, because of that ratio between our land base and our population, that we can actually achieve really high food self-reliance and in a sense have our cake and eat it too, and that we can still have an export sector as well while we're doing that. So that was maybe a little surprising because that was not the same situation in Southwest BC. But I'll let my colleagues answer as well. Kent, I'm sure, wants to say something. Maybe.
Yeah, I think the only other, those two things absolutely struck me. But Christy's right. Those of us who look at food systems closely are cognizant of the general outcomes of the contemporary food system. So there's some of the findings are not that surprising. One of the things, in addition to those that Christy mentioned, that surprised me was how the contemporary export-oriented sectors in the Okanagan are overshadow the economic benefits of re-regionalizing the food system in terms of mostly in terms of jobs and income generation. And I think that the economic impact of those sectors needs to be examined much more closely because of where the income flows and the extent to which it actually benefits the local economy.
Sorry, Myrna, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. You're talking about the money going offshore or foreign because of that's who's doing the jobs.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then do you take into consideration then that Canadians won't do the jobs, which we saw in COVID. For the same money, they will not.
Yeah, well, no, yeah, that's true. I mean, a really good point. That begs even a larger question of how we created an agriculture and food system economy the way we have. That literally only those that are desperate for work will do the work, and that they're willing to leave their families and their homes and their nations so that they can earn an income that those of us that live locally or even within the nation won't do because it doesn't pay enough.
Mhm.
This is a larger question and issue. Yeah.
And just to add on to that, I know we use the example of jobs as a form of economic linkages, but it isn't just limited to jobs. It's a larger food system in a globalized context where the economic linkages happen in other places as well. It's what happens when you have, the top 4 to 5 companies controlling globally 60% of the seed stock in the world. So we focused on that particular aspect, but it does relate to other aspects, definitely in the food system as well as part of this larger contextual problem.
I don't want to overstep. So Matthew, I can see you have your hand up, but somewhere in the discussion, I'd love to hear also when you're talking about re-regionalizing the food system, the stuff that you show is very much traditional, grow in the ground, field crop. And I'm wondering how you, or did your study think about, okay, vertical growing and growing that is not traditional by any means. I mean, Europe is way ahead of us on this, way ahead. So that's for later. Let Matthew first.
Yeah, Matthew, and then there's a question in the chat from Eric that will perhaps move after.
Hi, everybody. Fantastic presentation. Really enjoyed it. Lots of data and very surprising data, like what Marina said, regarding the impact of climate. It's kind of almost not new. I know organic farming is pretty hard on the environment regarding the manures and the tillage and the fuel and stuff like that, as well as importing food, opposed to like the emissions being somewhere else, then the food comes here. That's surprising and kind of opens your eyes a little bit regarding all that stuff. Like, have you guys like the next phase, you guys do some more studying and stuff like that? Like, have you guys thought about like what Mara said about the vertical towers? What about like the backyard farmers, like the backyard gardeners, like how much food households can grow in their backyard? Could that impact the environmental situation as well as the economic? I know you won't be making more, but families be saving more money if they've been growing their own food. That's kind of something to consider, I guess. So yeah, it's fantastic. I'm not sure if I have a question to be answered, but appreciate.
Yeah, of course.
Sorry, I just appreciate being able to attend and seeing this overall study, and I like to try to find the documents and try to read them all.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe, I can just quickly maybe address Matthew's point and Myrna's point about the, technological advancements and that kind of thing. So the data that we have is based on the existing agriculture system. And so that's kind of the assumption that we had to move forward with. So we didn't look at those kinds of innovations. And that would need to be, another level of study that would need to be looked at. So just because of the data that we had, I think we maybe have a bit of our focus is on regenerative agriculture at the Institute. And so we kind of see well, that's a whole other conversation, but we do see that kind of aligned with organic agriculture and soil-based agriculture and small-scale biodiverse farming. So that's, I guess, where we would probably be more likely to look at. But I don't know if the rest of my team wants to jump in on that. There's another question. The question in the chat was about organic agriculture as well. And I will just mention that our numbers don't reflect organic practices, again, because the data that we have, well, actually they may reflect whatever farming was happening in 2016. So some of that would have been organic, but we weren't able to parse out, you know, what was organic and what wasn't. And we recognize that, you know, changing the way that we're farming would have impact to some of those indicators as well. So I don't know, rest of team, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, well, I'll just add, Myrna, it's an interesting question, and I know we're all interested in it. My opinion as an agriculturist is that it will be land-based agriculture that feeds the human population in the decades to come. Most certainly, technological advancements will impact how we produce food. But quite frankly, the concepts of vertical towers and protected agriculture being significantly developed to impact our food supply significantly is not in the cards. As it exists now, it represents huge capital investments. There's huge questions about the sustainability of it. There's tremendous questions about who will benefit economically from it, and huge questions about the quality of the food that will be produced in these controlled methods. So I question personally, professionally, a focus on technologies, these significant technologies in feeding us into the future. I think we need to focus on how to use these natural resources in sustainable and regenerative ways to feed our communities, and will benefit much more significantly if we do that than focusing on these technological visions of our food system future. But again, that's not to say that technology won't play a role in how we produce food. I'd also like to note that I come by this opinion honestly. If you look at the technological revolution in agriculture and what we call modern agriculture, it has largely led to the environmental outcomes, deleterious outcomes of agriculture. They have largely led to the economic marginalization of our farming communities. They have largely led to the destruction of family-based farming, and they have driven people out of agriculture. And so I really think we need to collectively think long and hard and very clearly about where technologies will take us and what technologies are appropriate and what technologies will enable us to achieve what we want to achieve from a sustainability standpoint for our communities and for the environment and for our economic well-being. So it's a great question that has not a simple answer, but requires really substantive examination and debate around what we want to achieve. Suffice it to say that land-based agriculture can and will feed the world, in my opinion.
Well, can I say something regarding the vertical tower? I was involved in an Indigenous community doing a food security project, and they were looking into doing a lot of vertical towers for lettuces and stuff like that. What I found, like what Ken was saying about the cost associated to them, and then the maintenance, and then the fertilization for them. I don't think be good for large scale, you know, maybe for personal families, but then, you know, you can grow lettuce on the windowsill with a light, really. And there, yeah, just, and it really only you can only really grow lettuces. You can maybe grow tomato plants in it, but yeah, in our area, it'd be kind of very tricky. So I think, like what Ken said, we've got to start growing food on the land and utilizing that too. So
yeah, thanks. Do you see that question in the chat, Naomi?
For
yeah.
Sure.
Great.
G. Harris, I apologize, I don't know your first name, but the project is perhaps a bit more of a modeling and strategy question about outlining the strategies that explain how a regional food system can achieve higher levels of self-reliance compared to business as usual. I don't mind just starting with this, and I'll invite my colleagues to jump in, but for these scenarios and for the modeling for food self-reliance, we looked, the model does essentially is based on the population and the diet and the land base in the Okanagan, and ask the question, what mix of crops and livestock can we grow that will optimize food self-reliance, or that can best meet the dietary needs of the population based on this current diet that we have. So when we perform that optimization and we change the mix of crops and livestock to grow what people eat in the bioregion, essentially, that's when we see that big increase in food self-reliance. But we know it's not just a question of growing different things, and that the food system is a larger system that includes more than just production. So that's why particularly the post-production sector that links food production to people is a big area of development, and having that capacity to not only grow the foods that people eat, but also connect people to that food through distribution, processing, locally based and owned businesses that can prevent economic leakage and accrue better environmental or economic benefits to the region. So there are a few elements there, but from a modeling perspective, and the difference between those scenarios in the regionalized scenario is that we are producing on the land base a mix of crops and livestock that can best meet the dietary needs of the population.
Thanks for Naomi. It's Greg here, showing myself. I'm with KPU as well, like many of you, and work with the biology department as an ecologist and conservation biologist. Kent and I go back a few years now, so we've had contact and worked together before. It's really exciting to see this project not just come alive, but to blossom, and really just wanted to congratulate the whole team and Kent at the leading all of that. It's fantastic to see yet another regional food system in concept and in data show its potential benefits to the people that are making the decisions. If I can throw in another question here, I'm just wondering, and I don't know how easy or difficult it is to answer, but now that you guys are coming up with systems that do show potential benefits of changing a food system, what is it going to take for the policymakers, decision makers, to really enact the changes that need to be made to then follow through with the implementation of that? Do you see that as something that is really going to depend upon a new generation of leaders, that we have to wait a generation for new innovative thinkers to fill those positions of decision making, or do you see something happening in a much shorter time frame?
I don't know, Emily, did you want to jump in on that question? Maybe talk about our planner project?
Yeah, I think Christy mentioned some of the work that we're doing with partners across Canada related to food policy and planning. And this is a question that comes directly from a lot of the questions you're asking about what will it take in terms of policy and planning. And I think one thing that we can point to in particular is the sort of coordination between different jurisdictions and different levels of government. So we recognize that we work closely with local governments on this project in particular, and a lot of the information that we bring forward is targeted towards decision makers at the local level. But we recognize that local governments' power and influence may be limited when it comes to shaping food systems. So recognizing that bringing this information forward to help local government decision makers is important, but there's also a need to coordinate planning across different levels of government and engage in that kind of comprehensive planning and policy making that Christy talked about, that looks at different components of the food system and how do we integrate environmental policy and social policy and economic development and all of these parts of policy. So I think those are the questions that you bring up are kind of key questions that we are addressing in some of our other research that directly links back to this project in the Okanagan. But I would say, I think certainly we're seeing some policy innovations in different areas of the country. And as part of our policy research, we're trying to highlight and understand those different kind of food policy innovations. But we're also seeing the federal government engage in some sort of comprehensive policy development and recent investments and funding around addressing climate change mitigation in agriculture. So we're starting to see some of that kind of comprehensive policy making at different levels of government that's going to directly impact what local governments can do. So yeah, I think some of it is happening, but we're also asking these questions and trying to bring forth more information to really help and guide decision makers when it comes to food policy and planning.
So thanks again to everybody for your time, and I'm happy to stick around if there are other questions. I know, but it is 1 o'clock, so we want to respect everybody's time as well. So thanks very much. Thanks, Myrna. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for coming.